Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we're back from another episode of Libertarian Censored Podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Dan Patrick, separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the law subreddit. And yeah, I guess that's a clip of him saying that. And yeah, personally, I think separation of church and state is the Constitution. If you want to be pedantic, I guess you could say it's in the Bill of Rights, but in the not Constitution, if you want to consider those two separate documents. But yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is that you gotta separate church and state. But I think the big problem in politics these days is, for a lot of people, the state has become the church. You know, the state, the church is where you worship your ideology, and for a lot of people, that's very much the state these days, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Tax Land Not Man, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and that's rose from the Georgism subreddit, and it's a quote from economist Henry George: "When we tax houses, crops, money, furniture, capital, or wealth in any of its forms, we take from individuals what rightfully belongs to them, we violate the right of property, and in the name of the state commit robbery. But when we tax ground values, we take them from individuals what does not belong to them, but belongs to the community, which cannot be left to individuals without the robbery of other individuals." Henry George. And yeah, personally, I think, the libertarian position is, I do think Georgism and its land value tax would probably be better than what we have today, but I do think any form of taxation is theft. If you don't want to pay a tax, you shouldn't be forced to do so, even if it might be a more justifiable tax than what we have currently in the form of a land value tax. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have authoritarian spending 30% of their GDP to show a selfie, posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's looks like a clip from North Korea. When you take a fire selfie but you ban the internet in your country, and it looks like a hack from like the 2000s. It has Kim Jong-il instead of Kim Jong-un on top of a picture of him on top of a car. And yeah, personally, I think if people want to do that, ultimately authoritarians are going to do that. I'm sure I like the top comment here, Trump over here taking notes, because Reddit can only think of authoritarianism in terms of Trump. But, ultimately authoritarians are going to justify what they want to justify. If they want to justify putting a big picture of themselves on top of a car and show it to everyone, that's on them. Ultimately, I think, if people want to do that, I think that's fine, but I definitely would be critical if a dictator did that, especially since they're a state actor. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have PT, a libertarian party, is being created in Portugal, posted by Amugus Devilman, and that looks like a tweet from that Libertarian Party of Portugal about that, and then there's a picture of the founders of the party, and the OP added, "They currently need the signatures of enough Portuguese citizens in order to be legally created. They have been collecting signatures since September 2025, and yeah, personally, I think that's a good idea. I think we need as many libertarian parties around the world as possible, so that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Reddit CEO appears compliant with Musk's demands to take down his embarrassing pictures, but will not be silenced. And that's posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the SpaceX Pets subreddit. And that looks like a post from Malloy Rocks, who tweeted, "Never forget, this racist Nazi piece of shit helped get Trump into the White House." And it's a picture of a bunch of neo-Nazis, and a picture of Elon Musk, giving the salute at the inauguration. Some people say it's a Nazi salute, but ultimately, if you want to believe it's a Nazi salute or not, believe whatever you want to. But you got a lot of other politicians who you can take clips out of context of them making what looks like being Nazi salute, including Reddit Golden Boy Zoran Mamdani. He did, I think, that his inauguration, he did something that looked like kind of like a Nazi salute, but Reddit didn't care. Reddit only cares that what Elon looked like he did a Nazi salute because he's a member of the out group rather than the in group. Reddit used to love Elon, but then all of a sudden he joined the political out group, and suddenly he was the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you, these people have no principles, only teams. Their only rhetoric is in group good, out group bad. If Elon were a Democratic politician did the exact same gestures, the Reddit would be defending him. But since he's a member of the out group, he has to be a Nazi. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have S. Spanish PM lays out his blueprint to censor the internet, posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's a cross-post from the End Globalism subreddit, and I guess that's a clip of him saying that. Spanish, and I guess the The OP of the original post added the translation, I guess. Spanish PM Pedro Sanchez. Starting next week, my government will implement the following actions. First, we will change the law in Spain to hold platform executives legally accountable for any infringements taking place on their sites. Second, we will turn algorithmic manipulation and application of illegal content into a new criminal offense. Third, we will implement a hate of polarization footprint system to track, qualify, and expose how digital platforms fuel division and amplify hate. Fourth, Spain will ban access to social media for minors under the age of 16. Platforms will be required to implement effective age verification systems, not just checkboxes, but real barriers that work. Fifth and last, my government will work with our public prosecutor to investigate and pursue the infringements created by Grok, TikTok, and Instagram. And that was the source, and it was an ex post from Clash Report. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be censoring the internet, but ultimately the state's in a position where it can get whatever it wants to a lot of the time, and that includes the internet. I think it's only a matter of time before the Western internet starts looking like the Chinese internet with its great firewall that the government implemented over there. I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, I don't think the government should be controlling the internet. I think we have to defend freedom of speech. But, ultimately the government's in a position where it can justify whatever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, personally, I don't think we should be censoring the internet, but ultimately, it's one thing to call this out on Reddit in particular, because Reddit is, of course, the censorship capital of the internet, but they'll always justify it by saying, we're private actors, we can censor what we want. But, just because someone's a private actor doesn't mean that their censorship is justified either. I think the libertarian position is you got to stand against all form of censorship, whether it's state-based or from a private actor, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Supreme Court from 5 to 4. States can keep counting mail ballots that arrive after Election Day if postmarked in time. The court rules rejecting an RNC challenge posted by documents.lastweekinlaw.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, ultimately, the government can count whatever votes it wants to. But I think, if a ballot arrives after Election Day, I don't think it should be counted, even if it was postmarked in time. But ultimately, the state can justify counting whatever votes it wants to, but it's only going to undermine people's faith that elections are legitimate when one candidate wins. Well, and then suddenly the other candidate gets a bunch of mail-in votes and takes over and wins instead. It just kind of happened in Los Angeles. Spencer Pratt was supposed to advance to the runoff, but then they found a bunch of write-in votes or mail-in votes for the progressive socialist Neat Raman, and then she ended up advancing to the runoff instead in the Los Angeles mayoral election. I think that's gonna kind of make people see the elections as illegitimate. Personally, if I were in charge, I think you should only have open ballot in-person voting, but ultimately, it's whatever the state wants, I would say. Personally, I would rather not have any democracy at all, because democracy is forced collectivism, and I think if people want to have voluntary collectivism, that's fine, but I don't think people should be forced to collectivize if they don't want to. Next, we have DC reaches settlement with man who played Star Wars music at troops from taskandpurpose.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added ACLQ, who comes in again with a win for liberty. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the ACLU. I think they're very much a progressive activist group, but I do think, they made the right decision here. I don't think you should be purposely antagonizing troops by playing the Star Wars Imperial March at them, but I think if you want to justify doing that, you have every right to do so. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Mike Johnson unintentionally campaigns for the Democrats, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a bunch of pictures they did, it says, over the weekend, Geppetto's second favorite puppet boy began campaigning for the Democrats, albeit unintentionally. Johansson warned of a blue wave in November. They will turn every committee of Congress into an investigative body, and they'll go after the president's family, the cabinet, his donors, and his friends. Half of you in this room will be targeted. Johnson also warned of the Democratic Socialist insane proposals. Abolish the Electoral College and replace two-party system with multiple-party democracy, expand the House of Representatives, implement proportional representation, ranked choice voting, and military and economic aid to Israel, prosecute U.S. and Israeli leaders responsible for genocide in Gaza. Anyway, thanks, Mike. And yeah, personally, I think Reddit, of course, I personally would prefer a gold wave in the midterm, but Reddit, of course, wants a blue wave because Reddit only wants their authoritarians in there. They hate authoritarians when it has the wrong letter next to its name, but suddenly the in group will take power and they'll suddenly love authoritarianism again. It just goes to show you these people have no principles. That if it were up to them, we'd have a woke dictatorship. But of course, they think they're for liberty, but in reality, they're for woke tyranny rather than MAGA tyranny, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Supreme Court rules Trump can fire independent agency members, overturning 90-year-old ruling from NBCWashington.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if Trump wants to justify firing whoever he wants to fire, he should be able to. If they're supposedly an independent agency, Trump shouldn't be able to fire them. But ultimately, a lot of independent agencies are under the government umbrella. So ultimately, if the Supreme Court wants to rule that way and Trump wants to justify firing them, ultimately, it just goes to show you that, ultimately those in positions of power can justify whatever they want to, and oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. That's very much what power is. It's whatever those in charge say it is. Next, we have Justin. Trump bought up to $5 million of Axon stock. 2 weeks later, ICE moved toward a $220 million taser deal. Axon makes tasers and controls 90% of the U.S. taser market, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Fluent and Finance subreddit. And yeah, personally, that kind of seems like insider trading. But of course, Reddit only cares because Trump's a member of the in-group rather than the out-group. A lot of members of Congress insider trade, including famous in-group member Nancy Pelosi. That's why they named one of the most prominent congressional stock trackers the Nancy Pelosi tracker. But ultimately, Reddit only cares that because Trump's in the out-group. If he was in the in-group and doing the same thing, Reddit would be sweeping it under the rug. And that's my thoughts on that issue. It just goes to show you that, politicians are going to be self-serving just like everyone else. And I think that's important to remember as well. Government's going to be self-serving just like everyone else is going to be. Next we have Secretary Kennedy seems to have tried to bribe a Libertarian candidate into dropping out of a congressional race in Iowa from KWQC.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I think, that's another instance of the government trying to act in its own self-interest, because Libertarians are often seen as spoilers for Republicans. So, of course, Secretary Kennedy's technically independent, but, he's in the Republican administration, so of course he's going to try to bribe a third party to drop out. But ultimately, it just goes to show you that, if those in positions of power are going to justify abusing that power. Of course, Reddit will care when it's the out group, but when the in group does it, Reddit will be silent or justify it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, instead of sending billions to Israel's crimes, Democrats want to keep that money in America. Zoraid Mamdani, posted by Rabat Ascalon, and that's a cross-post from the Live News 24/8 subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't agree with Mamdani a lot, but I definitely would agree that it would be better keeping America's taxpayer dollars in America rather than sending them to foreign countries like Israel. But sadly, those in positions of authority can justify sending your taxpayer dollars wherever they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's why I think taxation should be voluntary, and if it is forced, you should at least be able to earmark where your taxpayer dollars go to. Next, we have what makes Marxism incompatible with libertarian ideas, posted by Lee Harvey Griswold. And yeah, personally, I think if people, I think the big thing with Marxism is that people want to use the state to enforce Marxism. I think if individuals want to do Marxism voluntarily, that they should be able to. But when it comes to voluntary Marxism, that's oftentimes very much an oxymoron, and that's I think why libertarians are generally against Marxism. Next, we have, in big win for Fourth Amendment advocates, the Supreme Court says geofence warrants count as a search, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think that's what the Supreme Court making a good decision. I think if the state wants to have geofence warrants, it should be able to. But I don't think they should be. If an individual doesn't consent to it, they shouldn't be forced to do them. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, it doesn't matter if they have a warrant or not. If you don't want to let them into your house to search, you should be able to. It doesn't matter what the Bill of Rights says. It's your property. You should be able to defend it however you feel like, regardless of what the state says. Next, we have Truth will out, foreign intelligence, and IPAC utilized leverage, aka tapes, on comprised congressmen to block the Massey Row bill to remove a foreign country's hostile takeover of the U.S. military. Call your representatives to remove this hostile takeover urgent. Posted by Jamjar0070, and that's cross-post from the Depropagandized News subreddit. And that's like a clip of a guy in a Guy Fawkes mask, probably an anonymous guy, talking about the what the headline says. And yeah, personally, I think, ultimately, I don't think they should be merging the U.S. military with the Israeli military, but ultimately, the Israel lobby is usually going to get what it wants, and that's very much how politics works. Whatever the lobbyists want, they'll usually get. Personally, I know a lot of people want to ban lobbying, but I personally think if they banned it, they just do it under the table, so I'm glad they have to do it out in the open instead, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Because, those in positions of just like those in positions of government authority, those in positions of private authority will be able to use their money to influence the government, regardless of what the law is, and that's very much how people are going to people are going to justify what they want to justify regardless of the system of government in place, and that's my thoughts there. And I had a post I wanted to share to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit as well. I said the paradox of libertarianism. I said, so recently I stumbled upon this article on Wikipedia, and I linked to a article on Wikipedia called Libertarian Authoritarianism, and I said, and at first glance kind of left off, obviously you can't be libertarian authoritarian, that's an oxymoron. Then I started really thinking about it. If people are seeking to control you through the state, won't you be justified using your powers to disenfranchise them to make sure they don't do that? I know progressives love to use the paradox of tolerance, which I personally think is kind of bullshit, but it's kind of the same idea here. If a libertarian society is to survive, it has to actively suppress those who seek to enforce their values and others, which is authoritarian in its own right. Thoughts. And yeah, personally, I don't think, you should be justifying authoritarianism regardless of it's against people who want to enforce stuff on you. Ultimately, I think, but ultimately you do have to justify, stopping those who seek to control you, and it's very much a paradox, I would say, like I said in the post title. So yeah, but ultimately people are going to justify what they want to justify, and, I think, libertarians need to support people justifying whatever they want to, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. But oftentimes, people are going to use the people of the state to hurt other people, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. So that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.